All right, and the record button also has moved. We are now doing session 26 on the book of Ezekiel. Yes, we are, I think not quite, and we might be halfway. We're not halfway through the Bible, but we're definitely past the halfway point of Old Testament books.
Can't I find it?
After Lamentations, after Jeremiah.
Going back, for those of you who missed Jeremiah or Lamentations, those are both written by the prophet Jeremiah, and they kind of deal. Jeremiah was writing at a time again that he prophesied that the Babylonians would take over Judah and that the Israelites would be exiled for 70 years, but yet still has this hope of this new covenant that sort of shifts. And but in that, he also has the writing of this Lamentations that we looked at last week. And then again, that's just that sense of the lament, the feeling of that God has somehow departed Israel and has abandoned them. And we kind of pick up the story in a similar way in a similar time. And I'll highlight, I actually found it kind of interesting because the timing of how this works sort of brings the scope or the telescopes on a little bit more of the events that were happening in Jerusalem around the time of the Babylonian siege. And the funny thing is, as I say all of that, I realize that that this is something that I have a framework for this movement, and I think the challenge is sometimes from the creation of the world and the Adam and Eve and the fall up till about David, I always was pretty solid on terms of the movement of that. And again, then there's this movement that after David, almost not quite 1,000 years, but really 400 years goes on after the reign of King David. And what we're dealing with now in all of these prophets, and particularly these major prophets, we were dealing with what was going on right before the fall. And remember that Solomon was there, and then Solomon's son split the kingdom. The northern kingdom is Israel, the southern kingdom is Judah. Southern kingdom had some bad kings mostly. Northern kingdom was all bad kings. Northern kingdom was attacked by the Assyrians and eventually conquered. And the southern kingdom actually had made some alliances. And I was reading today, it said they were a vassal of the Assyrians. So in other words, they were so they started making allegiances with them, probably for protection or for security that the Assyrians wouldn't come and overtake them. Now, they didn't make those with the Babylonians. And they did toward the end. There was sort of a new Babylonian or neo-Babylonian sort of political powers that they were making allegiances along with Egyptians. And really what Ezekiel is going to deal with is not just that they don't follow the law right before all of this calamity happens, but really he's addressing much the two primary issues. One would be idolatry. The Israelites in Jerusalem in particular had taken on the worship of other idols, and of these other idols and these other religious belief systems actually sanctioned doing other things, so it led to other wickedness. But also just the general sense of injustice that came from worship of those idols. But we'll get to that in a minute. But in general, where we're gonna place Ezekiel is right before the siege of the Babylonians on Jerusalem. So what happened really, if you want to just put it in, is that the Babylonians came in and attacked, and they didn't conquer the city necessarily, but they took a good faction of the Jews as exiles into Babylonian captivity. And then it was during this time, and actually they assume maybe about 5 years after. And so what happened? Sorry, let me back up. And Ezekiel was a priest, an Israelite priest, who was taken in this first wave. So the Babylonians attack, and they take some Jews and they send them off into Babylonian exile into Mesopotamia, which is kind of like if you were looking at the map of where Israel is, they kind of went maybe a little bit northeastish. And what happened in that time was Ezekiel, the priest, who was 25 at the time when they left, went to Mesopotamia and was the river Kebar near the river. And that's kind of where the book starts. 5 years after this captive exile from the Babylonians, you have Ezekiel sitting on the riverbed, and it sort of starts the book with this vision of what's happening and his calling story, and that's where the story picks up. But prior to that, keep in mind, he was a priest. He was functioning in the temple in some fashion in Jerusalem. And then what happens is, as the story unfolds, he prophesies beforehand that Jerusalem is going to get destroyed. And this time, Jerusalem was not destroyed. The temple was not destroyed. It was all still, I mean, for the most part, intact, I guess. They just, maybe there was some destruction, some damage. But then there was a second siege of Babylon that destroyed the temple and set Jerusalem on fire. It was just a big mess, and so it made it uninhabitable in a major way. And people would still live there in the surrounding area and probably in some places in Jerusalem. But then you had another exile of people that went east as well. So does that make sense? Do you have that sort of framework? This is what he's talking about. And so what he is addressing in this is very similar to what we saw in Jeremiah and in Isaiah. Jeremiah prophesied as well, and then ended up, and he was in the second wave, and then journeyed through that time of exile. And then, and so it was around these similar times, they're all prophesying basically that Israel's messed up and God's going to punish them. All right. Now, with that sort of just the general framework of where that fits in history, let's go through just sort of some information about the book as a whole. It is the third of the major prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, being the first two, and this is considered the third. It's a lengthy book. It's 40 some chapters. It's part of the Tanakh, which again is the prophet section of the Hebrew scripture. It was written by the prophet Ezekiel ben Buzzi. I only say that just because I thought it was B-U-Z-I. I thought it was kind of funny. Like if you're gonna have a Ben something, Ben Buzzi sounds pretty good. But the thought is that Ezekiel actually, of the major prophets, is the most organized of the books, compared to Jeremiah, which was a mess, and Isaiah, which read in three different parts, like three different books, three different time periods put together. So this is considered largely to be a cohesive book, but with the idea that there are things that scholars think were added along the way, just bits of information. But in general, most scholarship says, hey, Ezekiel is probably the main author of the book. Whether he was the ultimate end compiler, probably not, or whether there was additions, that's okay. We're still getting some portrait of who he was and what he was doing in this. He was born around 623, which doesn't mean much, except for the fact you may remember we talked about a King Josiah of the southern kingdom of Judah. And King Josiah, basically, there was a period around the time that Ezekiel was born, around these 620s, where the Assyrian influence from the north was not as strong, and that's when Josiah in the south put in sort of a reform. Josiah was one of the better kings. And then there was the beginning of this Babylonian takeover. And then that ultimately is what caused the Exodus. So in the period of the time that he was born, from 327 till about, they thought he went into, I don't know, when exile, what was the date? I don't remember. What was it? Around the 590s, they thought he went into 593, maybe. Again, these are numbers, but well, actually, it would have been maybe 5 years before that, 598. But the idea behind it was he was living in Jerusalem at a time where there was a religious reform happening. And that religious reform was happening in between a time where Assyrians were encroaching upon the southern kingdom, and the Babylonians then were encroaching from the east. And so you had this sense of pressure that he would have been a part of this context of feeling like there was an insecurity of Jerusalem. And this comes out in a way that almost is, not want to say it's passive aggressive, it's pretty aggressive. I mean, Ezekiel is one of the more vivid and assertive prophets in the sense of what he's saying. He doesn't pull any punches. He was in exile for about 24 years, and that was really kind of the length of his prophetic ministry beyond his time of being a priest. He is the main character of the book, along with Israel, and he is interacting with Israel, and sometimes it goes from this is like the crazy prophet on the corner of the street, and he is considered the more theatrical, and we'll look at some of the theatrics that he used in a moment, but he would sort of do dramas basically to kind of illustrate God's prophecy, which I think is fascinating. He just was more of a dramatic person in general, I guess. He was commissioned in 593, meaning that was his calling, and we'll look at that calling. That's the first couple chapters deal with that. And really the book as a whole has this sort of interesting facet of being a prophet. He's called as a sentinel among exiles. They refer to him as a sentinel, which, you know, I mean, kind of in other words, he was there for kind of to teach, or as a grounding piece, as a guard for their Jewish identity to some extent. He only spoke to the Israelites when God directly commanded him to. In other words, it was kind of like he was more of a funnel, although maybe he took some liberties in how he interpreted how he should say that. And one of the other things that I thought was very interesting is that God commanded him to eat a scroll, like literally eat paper or whatever it was. And it was a book of Lamentations, not the book of Lamentations, probably. He was like, I don't want Jeremiah's book yet. I'm going to eat it. No, but just as a interesting side, he has 6 visions throughout the book that we'll look at, and really the funny thing is they're very kind of trippy and apocalyptic. Like, you think maybe he discovered some peyote or something and he was munching on that, or however that's consumed. I'm not sure. I'm not from this part of the country, but he's kind of in the and actually, strangely enough, the trippiness of it is interesting because the book of Revelation mentions Ezekiel more than any other, than it's mentioned in all of the rest of Scripture. And if you know that my feelings on Revelation, that it's also a trippy experience. So these two have some similarity, but only in the vision sequences. So like if you're going to illustrate this as a play, you'd have to have like a stage switch where everything went psychedelic and weird. But there is something interesting, and actually, interestingly enough, there's a lot of the whole notion of the second temple or the new world order sort of thing comes out of this book as well. So there are those who tend towards more of an apocalyptic and future kingdom of God in some way will rely on Ezekiel for some of those visions. Its central proclamation is really kind of comes in 3 parts. It's through the book, and it kind of frames the structure of it. It's sort of the destruction of Israel, and with that, the destruction of Jerusalem, and with that, the destruction of the temple, and the overthrowing or the upsetting of the tradition of having a king. So the kingship structure or the monarchy structure is disrupted. So you got to, again, like we talked about last week in Lamentations, as they really had this empathetic sort of cry of where is all of this, you know, in this time, like the idea that Ezekiel was saying, this is not just the end of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. This is the end of the temple. There will be no temple. The temple is where God dwelt. And this is a major theme that sort of underlies Ezekiel, the sense of God's presence. So the destruction of the temple means the destruction of the place where God dwelled, and this taps into Ezekiel's vision as a whole. So it deals with the destruction of those things, and then also the end of Israel's claim to this promised land. And really, this was the last time where they had some sort of solidified occupation of a large swath of it. And although they're restored and it grows, it never is quite the same. This land that over this several hundred-year period that went from the Davidic kingdom to this time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, you went from having this massive powerhouse of a kingdom and this nation established that was known from afar to almost an ethnic group that was dispersed and exiled and put into captivity, and this massive reversal. And what makes this book so powerful, as does also Jeremiah and Isaiah to some extent, in particular Jeremiah and Lamentations, is that there is a credit that God is credited for this destruction. And again, this raises issues of providence. Yeah, Glenda.
Well, God had made a covenant to give them that land. So what happens then to that covenant?
Well, this is part of the challenge of Ezekiel. Is the big question of the day at the time when this was written was, is God done? Mm-hmm. God gave, David an everlasting covenant and said, but there is, and we'll see in the second half of the book, or really the third half of the book, we'll see there's a promise of a future kingship, which does turn into the Messiah, not into a king as was in David and Solomon's in preceding reigns for that time. God, and it's important to remember that God never wanted a king system. That was a request of the Israelites to pattern their government or their governing after the same model that other nations had. And God relented and said, okay, you can have one. They chose Paul or Saul, and it didn't work out. So then God said, no, I'm going to stick. And then it didn't work out then either. I mean, I think David and Solomon were, not the greatest either. Not that I'm, they were obviously more important than in the history, but they weren't perfect by any means. Okay. The political context is, in some sense, I wrote down just the context. There were a lot of superpower politics going on. In other words, you had Egypt in the mix, you had Babylonians in the mix, you had the Assyrians in the mix, you had the smaller ruling factions of Israel in the mix, and still you have a conquered northern kingdom and a barely free southern kingdom, and they're all making alliances. And so you had a lot of political stuff that was already in the mix. You had immense idolatry, and even one of Ezekiel's visions has this sense of that this idol worship is happening right outside the temple. And so it's a major theme of Israel has betrayed the worship of the one true God for the worship of these false gods. And that's really ultimately what they get in trouble for. And I think why it's kind of like, well, you know what? I've given you all this. I've given you my presence. I don't know what else to do for you. So I'm done. And again, that's what makes Jeremiah's sort of new covenant thing in the middle there in 31 so significant, is because God's like, you know what? I can't rely on humanity to make this covenant work. You all keep screwing up. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to put the law on it. And then something shifts. Remember we talked about something shifting in Jeremiah from that communal sense of accountability for Israel into more of that individual sense of accountability for each human being. Well, we see that in various ways in Ezekiel as well. So it's kind of like a major shift in thought around what it means to be held. See you, Jim. To be held accountable. Thanks again for the Porsches. I should have said that. I got a package today. I'll probably show this on Sunday. I got a package on Sunday or today, and I have now I have 5 Porsches. See,
Guess what?
this is a police Porsche. I don't even think that exists. I think that's just a phony car. And this one has a removable sunroof too. All right, that's more than you need to know. If you want to play with my Porsches, I know. Thank you, Jim and Glenn, for blessing me with. Jim said, "You know what? When you ask God for something, and I think he got me there. You missed the point that I was trying to make, but anyway, back to the there was a lot of and that's the idolatry we were going back talking about, and that led to a lot of corruption in the military or government. It led to increased crime in a number of ways, and there was generally this sort of oppressive economic system that existed in Jerusalem at that time, and all of these things led to and Ezekiel would have been, seen all of much of this happen. So the visions that he has, we're going to talk about in a minute, really come true and sort of resonate with him. And as a consequence of all of the prophets, perhaps he is the most theatrical. And we're not going to, and I'll note where some of those theatrics are, and you can read to the extent of some of them. But he is, he's doing little dioramas or little plays almost in the streets. And then he's got like these protests where he's laying on his one side for all the time, and then for every day that he lays on his side, that's how the Northern Kingdom, I don't remember exactly what it was, that would get punished or have bad stuff happen to them. And then he laid on his other side, that's the Southern Kingdom. So he's doing all these antics because he's just trying to get the attention of the people. Jan, were you going to say something? No. All right. All right, let's dig into, I want to go over themes real quick so we can talk about them as they come. So there are questions of God's limits from a theological perspective that Ezekiel brings up. Is God, and this is the big tension between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The God of the New Testament is perfect love, perfect holiness, loves everyone. And the God of the Old Testament is like, let's smite them for their disobedience and destroy everybody. And we don't really do a good job in the North American church in general of reconciling those two images. And I think that this book adds to that question of those limits, because some of these curses that happen are like, Ezekiel's like, this is from God, and they're ugly. And so the question is what are God's limits of wrath versus God's limits of love? Is God interacting? And this is where we've talked about process theology, which is that God is unfolding in the story as we are. God's a legitimate player in the same way we are. So doesn't have divine foreknowledge of what will happen. Not that God couldn't, just that there's a self-limiting to say, I'm going to participate in life in a genuine way, and I'll intersect when I need to, and I'll be present. So there's more of but that idea that what are God's limits, this really pushes the boundaries in some ways. Glenda, there's a robber behind you.
He's on his way out.
All right, the presence of God is a major thing, and you'll, if you read through it yourself, you'll probably pick it up more in the English. You'll see it translated as glory, but the presence of God, as I said, really, in my opinion, the presence of God is a huge theme that runs through all of these books. I think you can sort of gauge all of these by, like, where's God's presence? What's happening? And God's presence begins in all of this still in the temple, theoretically, but what part of the vision that Ezekiel has is that God's presence is leaving Jerusalem, and that really brings those larger questions of, has God abandoned the covenant? Because God is, if the feeling, the God has been with Israel for so long now. You got to remember, for even in the bad times, except for when they stole the Ark of the Covenant, that the temple, God was still in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and that was there for at least about 400 years by this point. So that's a long time to feel God's presence in a place that is in proximity to you, and then to no longer feel that. And then there's the question of, will God return? There's stuff that in terms of his own prophecies that point towards Israel's lack of purity and their need for purification. There are some, and we won't get into this, so I'll just throw it out there. It is the book that is, I sort of mentioned this earlier, there's the book that is sort of used for conversation around the Second Temple mysticism or New Temple in the future. We borrow that, a little bit of the vision for the New Temple and the New Heaven and the New Earth. We'll borrow some imagery from that. Rabbinic Judaism relies on it in the same way. So there's like this mystical sort of vision for what the future will be. In Ezekiel, it actually describes in the second or the final third of it, maybe, some of the specifications of what this new temple will look like. And there are those in the camp that believe that these are like, this is not just symbolic. This is like God gave Noah the cubic feet of the ark, in the same way God gave Ezekiel the cubic feet and description of what the new temple will be someday. And the last thing, again, and I said that before, was that there's a general theme of individual responsibility. And this is a major shift, because remember, before this, sins of one generation were punished from the sins of the other generation. They were judged as a people, as a whole generation, as a community of people that are being judged together. And then through this time, both we see it in the writings of Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, but particularly in Jeremiah, there's a strong emphasis of, and because of that new covenant, of shifting the responsibility to the individual. In other words, if I am communally responsible for handing on you, I'm actually writing about this in this intergenerational book, because I'm making an argument for intergenerationality through scripture. And I can't, is the truth. I said generationally, you can talk about Old Testament in terms of generations. God says, pass it on from children to your children's children, pass it on from one generation to the next. There's always this sense of still a male-dominated world where everyone else is sort of covered under that male spirituality. As long as the man was circumcised and the household was okay, everyone in the household was covered. Well, in the New Testament, that's not the case. I could be doing great, and then that means that Shannon, Judah, and Silas are still on their own. They got to still fend for themselves when it comes to the judgment before God. That's not how it was in the Old Testament. And that shift begins to happen in these books. So absorb that just for a second. That's a major difference in, the accountability. Adam and Eve brought sin into the world for everyone. God is redeeming the world through Israel, but was judging them as a nation until this time, around this time, the destruction, where everyone feels like God's leaving. All of a sudden shifts. God's like, I'm tired of trying to get everyone to do this together. It's not going to work. Now, I'm going to eventually put my law into your heart, and then you are going to be accountable for you. So, okay. Those are the themes that run through it, and we're going to go through the thing as a whole. What any questions before we dive into the sort of structure of the book? This is I said this as I said last week. I didn't know anything about Ezekiel until this week. I've been reading about it, trying to figure out how to put it together in my head, and I still haven't. But hopefully that's helpful. Just sort of, they all kind of do the same thing. Honestly, at some point I'm like, all of these Old Testament books are just saying the same thing. Israelites unfaithful, God's faithful, but there, and again, that's because the Jews view these as their history books, not necessarily as their character building books. And in fact, there's probably not a lot from them that you're going to form good moral character from. More so, you'll see that if you disobey, and challenge of that is, even that's the old system. You read all these stories about Israel not doing what they should, disobeying, and have curses fall on them, and calamity falling on them. Well, that cause and effect, that retributive justice, isn't really the way it works in the New Testament. And Christ was that divine reversal that changed it all. So really, even from our perspective, as we look back, not only are they not good moral characters because they're all failing, we see God's faithfulness, but really in the end, the whole system of what was isn't even the system now. So the question becomes, why is all that there? Well, because it tells us God's inclusion, the story of God's redemption of the world through Israel, and eventually including us in that process, as we're witnessing in these prophetic books. All right. Yes.
Question. One thing that struck me, I skimmed through it, and is how often Ezekiel was told, warn the people, warn the people, warn the people. Over and over and over, God said, if you keep worshiping idols, you will be punished. And it just like, I can't imagine why God kept giving them warnings when they weren't learning, for one thing. And then the other thing that I had a question about as I was looking through it. It seems almost as though they're warned, either change your behavior or you will be punished. But if you change your behavior, then you will be saved. Well, then that comes down to, I mean, is that in just because it's Old Testament before Christ, it's all up to them to save themselves?
No, I mean, it's not for them to save themselves, but it is contingent upon their behavior in the way that it isn't for us.
Right.
I mean, and here's the thing, and again, we have to always remember that that we have the Spirit.
Yeah.
They didn't have in their hearts. They had no. We don't even have a concept of what a heart, what a human heart is. Not a literal heart, but the essence of our existence. Human heart is without the guidance of the Spirit, and without God's law being written in it. And I think that's why there's so much grace over everything that happened in the Old Testament. And honestly, you know, I've been wrestling with this as I've taught this over the last few months of just like, how do you reconcile, like I'm wrestling, how do you reconcile this ugly picture of who God is in the Old Testament? These aren't pretty pictures. I mean, like anyone who says, oh, God's all love and just, you know, foo and flowers, that's not true. And honestly, if you think that, then you're blind. You've completely shut out a whole portion of the scriptures and are honestly just being a horrible exegete at that point, because you're just fashioning God to whoever you want God to be. But there is this sense of genuine encounter with God, and God not wanting to let go, but getting to the point where the idolatry was really, and that even reveals something about God's character. Well, it wasn't about all the, I mean, you know, you look at, you know, we look at King David and Solomon and be like, well, holy cow, they had how many wives? I mean, the sexual sins that were going on there, I can't even imagine, not to mention the other stuff. And really those things displeased God, I'm sure, to some extent. But I think there was probably some compassion, like, look at these stupid little humans, don't really understand what they're doing. But what God didn't tolerate was the worship of other gods.
Yeah.
Like, if I have not proven, if the stories of these people, you know, if the people of Israel have not proven to you how faithful I am and call you to that obedience, but even in that sense, in some regard, I don't think they had the capacity truly to be righteous. And I think that when you had someone, you know, and when you see God's Spirit come down upon different individuals, God's Spirit is the functioning agent in that person. God's Spirit is the one empowering that Moses to go and Joshua to lead and you know, and all the rest, you know, the judges and the prophets and the kings. God's Spirit was the one that was leading them. Well, now God's Spirit leads all of us. So for us to turn and then, you know, so in some sense in the Old Testament, them saying yes to God truly was a choice of their own volition. Whereas that's why in the New Testament church, and we tend to say our capacity to turn to God really can't even be credited to our own human ability to choose. We have been able to choose because we have been enabled by the Spirit to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Denny.
Yeah, and we've brought this up before, and that's basically what you're talking about. The God of the Old Testament, in the way we're receiving him, was totally different from the God of the New Testament.
Yeah.
And we're saying that through Jesus, who is God, the Lord. So what happened? Who changed? Did God change? Did he decide that, hey, this isn't working this way? Yeah. Or what happened?
Well, no one knows, first of all. And remember that I like the passage about the foolishness. And so what I'm about to say is probably foolishness. But I'll say it nonetheless. In my opinion, God was using the systems that we as humanity have developed in the civilization of the earth to function in his interactions with us. In other words, I think that, you know, and I still haven't sorted it out in my head. You go back to that Abraham, we talked about that way back when, but Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice, and whether God actually was asking, was God, like, hey, let's kill some babies. It doesn't really make a difference. Let's see if they follow through with that. Maybe not, or maybe God did call him to that because that was a practice of the nations around. The notion of sacrifice, or the idea of sacrifice, was something that we have no record of God saying this is how it's going to be. What we do know is that directly after the fall, and you have a few babies in the mix, and you have Cain and Abel, and one of them is sacrificing a burnt offering, and the question becomes, what is that? Or not a burnt offering, just an offering. And what is that like? Why? And so there's clearly something apart about our fallenness that feels like we need to make appeasement. There's a German systematic philosopher named Friedrich Schleiermacher who talks about our absolute dependence on God. And there's this moment in every human being's life where they're sort of overwhelmed by the world, and they realize how insignificant they are in relationship to this divine being that we have, we call God. And in that moment, there's a realization of the fragility of our mortal beings versus the vastness of the world. And that puts things into a right account. And maybe the fallen response to that is some form of sacrifice. And God's like, hey, if that's what they're going to do, I'll work within that system. So that's my explanation. God works within the foolish systems that we have created. In the same way, like, as much as I'll harp till I'm blue in the face or cold in my grave against the prosperity gospel, because I think it's false teaching, and I think it's completely opposite of what the gospel calls us to. But does that mean that there isn't genuinely people who are confessing a faith in Christ in the midst of that? No. Christianity, or faith in God, comes in all sort of flavors. And really, I try to take the position it's not mine to judge. I think growing up in the Pentecostal church, coming to the Reformed tradition, and having a wife who grew up Catholic, and all of our own wanderings, I've come to a place where I'm like, I don't think any of us have it right. And maybe if we just stopped bickering over who has it right and actually started loving one another, the world would be like, hey, this is something to this. But until then, we're the fools who God is pleased by.
So you're saying then that God blends according to the people of the day. So what would he be today?
What do you mean?
Well, he blended. He was one way in the Old Testament, and he blended into a different situation with the New Testament. How would that? And that was 2,000 years ago. So what would it be like today then? What would the God of today? Would he be different?
I think from the time of New Testament writing, you had, again, that Greek influence, that Hellenization, as it's called, and you have all those Greek ideals that influence the who God is. And so what you have is you have the revelation of Christ, who comes and has this divine reversal of everything in the world. All of a sudden, it's not about power, it's about humility. It's not about strength, it's about weakness. And it's just divine reversal of everything. So everything's turned upside down. At the same time, you have Greek mythology and Greek philosophy and Greek spirituality that ultimately, and Greek culture in general, that affects the thinking of the whole region all the way through Jerusalem. And so you have all of a sudden the notion of this perfect God with perfect love and perfect knowledge and perfect foreknowledge and all powerful. And it's fashioned after the God of that time. Now, because we're a New Testament church, we rely, and because we, in some sense, have looked at these books that have been canonized as a part of our scripture. And this is where we go back to the very beginning, 26 some weeks ago, where we talked about the notion of inerrancy or infallibility, or those terms there. We have given authority to these books in the way they were written. And that authority that we as a large structure of 2,000 years of spiritual seekers have given to those books shapes the way our understanding of God is. So this notion of this divine sort of Greekish type God that is all perfect is something that is derived from the time where that region of the world was influenced by Greek thought. Today, we're influenced by consumerism. In fact, there's so much about our church culture in North America today that just reeks of consumeristic culture that really only came about over the last 50 to 80 years. Church hopping and shopping. If you look back at the way, sometime I'll do my intergenerational stuff. I don't teach around that. But if you look back at the silent generation, it was a pastoral model of the church, where the pastor was there as kind of your little professor, teaching and offering theology, distributing, pastoral care where needed. And then everyone else in the church did everything else. And you didn't need anyone else in the church in terms of an associate pastor or directors of education or anything like that, because everyone else, filled in the gaps. And that's because that's what happened in that culture. It was the silent generation were a culture of volunteerism and civic duty. So that's why you had Lions clubs and Rotary clubs and Kiwanis, whatever, all the rest of them. You had everyone volunteering, and you had a whole society that would run this way. Well, that's shifted in the boomer generation. All of a sudden, there was this rise of psychology, and everyone said, oh, it's not about the collective, it's about my individual personhood, my experience. And so this gives rise to women's rights and sexual revolution and civil rights and all these things that are like, hey, we're all individuals, we need to focus on who we are. And that's great. I think there's a redeeming part of that. And I think that's part of the expansion of the gospel. But at the same time, that also ramps up the individualism of the world is there for me to experience myself and to have my own fulfillment happen, rather than the collective communal nature that we saw in the silent generation. So are you following me? And so what happened in all of that is we're like, well, you know what? And then in educational psychology and philosophy came up, and all of a sudden we were like, everyone learns at different rates. Everyone learns differently. We need to make a group for the kids, and we need to make a group for the teenagers. And then we need to hire someone to go over those. And then people stopped volunteering for those things because we were hiring and developing professional categories for all these different ages and stages of the church. And it led to ultimately the place where we're like, you know what? I'm going to go to a church that feeds me and to get what I get out of it. And we took our kids out of the church and we put them in the Mickey Mouse over here. And now they had all their formation with animal crackers and apple juice and games. And then when it came time to enter into the big church and the normal church, they were like, that doesn't look anything like my Mickey Mouse here. Why would I want to come? And so now we're facing the largest hemorrhaging of young adults or anyone in the church sent for the last 2,000 years.
That's brilliant. That is brilliant. That really is.
Yeah.
So we can talk more about that. That is what that is the world I traffic in. When I teach about intergenerational formation, that is part of my argument for why we are where we are and why young people are leaving. And my solution to that, amongst many in this conversation, is we need to bring our young people back into the sanctuary, and we need to figure out what intergenerational worship and formation looks like, so that we're all being formed in the same practices and rituals, so that you're never apart from those things, and they form you throughout, and they're generationally formed to the point where everyone and so you never leave it. But we'll get into that later. I really just looked at the time. I'm like, I just been bantering on about nothing. I mean, about something, not about nothing. Good stuff, perhaps, but not what we. So does that, Danny? I guess that's my answer. I think we fashion a God who we wanted the God to be. I think people, and it's one of those things. Sometimes people want God to be a man. Some people want God to be a woman. The truth is, God is neither. God is not sexed. God does not have genitalia. God is a spirit and does not fall into those categories. But God created us, and we use the male and the masculine pronoun. God created us, but actually the verse, when it says in Genesis 1, it says, let us, plural. Oh, I lost someone. Someone was like, I'm getting out of this. Let us, it was Jan. She was like, I'm out of here. Let us create mankind or humankind in our image. There's a plurality to God in the first chapter of the Bible. And then it says, let us make them male and female. And so there is a large argument that somewhere in the image of God, you have both facets of maleness and femaleness. Now you can take that in lots of different directions, but I would say that God is asexed or agendered in the sense of it just is not a category. those are parts that were given to us so we could fulfill the original covenant to be fruitful and multiply. Yes.
Isn't the difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New, the transition or the pivot there is that God's justice was satisfied once Christ came and his sacrifice was accomplished. And once his justice was satisfied, it wasn't up to us. It was all through Christ's work.
Yeah.
And so then there wasn't this emphasis on following the law and you know, that it was up to us somehow to obey.
Not following the Mosaic law, but there was still a law to follow in that law. And that's kind of like, you know, it's like, you know, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth in the Old Testament, turn your cheek in the New Testament, love your neighbor as your enemy, put others, consider other, you know, like it's pretty clear. Right. Consider others as you regard others before yourself.
Yeah, I'm not saying that anything goes after Christ died, but it isn't the means for our survival or our salvation.
No. And I would see the burnt sacrifices as appeasing God's wrath, and bringing some assurance of atonement, but not ultimately removing the culpability of the sinfulness. And that's what Christ did for us. We're still sinners, but in God's eyes, we're redeemed. All right, let's go back.
Thank you.
I love that you all are interested in this stuff because I like theology. So it's nice to know that you do too. Let's go through this book. And I'm just going to kind of flip through like we normally do to kind of give you, and honestly, it like the outline in my Bible of the book, I thought, and I always kind of go through the outlines to see where things are broken up, and it is fairly broken down. And I'm sure in your Bible you might have an outline. If you don't have an outline in your Bible, you know, you don't have introductions or they don't have some timelines and those sort of things. Those are always nice to have. I think they're helpful when you use them. In general, the book is broken up into, and there's debate. Some people say 4 sections, some people say 3 sections. I don't really know if I care how many sections there are. We're just going to go through them sort of section by section, and you can decide at the end how you want to put those. And remember, there are themes of God's presence, this sort of individual responsibility, God's punishment and over Israel, and you know, God's providential nature. Those are all factor in there. But I'm just going to go through and highlight some of the ideas. So what we have here is, you go to chapter 1, and then it says vision of the chariot. And so this says basically the 13th year in the 4th month on the 5th day of the month, I was among the exiles at the river Chabar. The heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. And so he goes on to describe this vision, and you could almost draw it out. It was a platform with 4 living creatures that are around it, that each had 2 heads, and their wings formed sort of a support for the platform. And there were wheels that were beneath them, and there was a throne on top, and it was meant to capture this idea of God's glory, or the word would be Shekinah glory. Growing up, I always heard the Shekinah glory, and that really the Shekinah glory refers to the presence. God's presence was considered God's glory. You see the same word. It's the word is, where is it? Kavod in Hebrew, and the word means glory, but it really signifies that presence of God. And you see that both in Sinai, where God calls Moses to take off his sandals, and also in resting in the tabernacle during David's times as well. That sense of that of God's presence there, and God's glory was seen in that. But he sees this vision, and sort of God as this divine warrior, and sort of this throne battle chariot sort of thing, and that's all in the first. And then you have this sense of him. He's called in 2:3. It says in 2, he said to me, "O mortal, stand to your feet, and I will speak with you." And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me. Again, like I said earlier, These people weren't doing them on their own volition. This was God's Spirit in them, empowering them to do that. What we have been all empowered to do now, that sentence of the priesthood of all believers, we've all been empowered. The Spirit entered me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking, and he said to me, mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me, and they and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day. And at the age of 30, God is calling Ezekiel away from this priestly ministry towards a prophetic ministry. And it goes on and it says exactly what he's supposed to, like what he'll do. And so these probably 1 through 3 has this call narrative. He's being sent, and someone else put in the words, as a watchman over Israel. And not just this. Remember, he was part of the Exiles, so he wasn't there. So he was a part of this sort of colony of Israelites living in exile. But the thought is that these callings would spread even beyond. He was condemning them, not for their failure to keep the law. You'll find that in this first few chapters, but because of their idolatry and their injustices, and you'll find that throughout the, chapters 8 through 11. But I do want to go back before I go that far. I'm a little out of order here. I want to go back to 5:13, because I really think that's just in terms of our portrayal of who God is. It says, my anger shall be spent itself, and I will vent my fury on them. This is God talking, and satisfy myself. And they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my jealousy when I spend my fury on them. Moreover, I will make you desolate and an object of mocking among the nations around you in the sight of all that pass by. You shall be a mockery and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations around you. When I execute my judgments on you in anger and in fury with furious punishments, I, the Lord, have spoken. When I loose against you my deadly arrows of famine, arrows for destruction, I will let loose and destroy you. And when I bring more and more famine upon you and break your staff of bread, I'll send famine and wild animals against you, and they will rob you of your children. Pestilence and bloodshed shall pass through you, and I will bring the sword upon you. I, the Lord, have spoken. So to your point, Denny, I mean, this is like, and honestly, I wish I had a better way to tell you how to reconcile this with the God of the New Testament, other than what I really rely on in my own life is to say that none of us really got it right. And this doesn't mean that I don't believe in the infallibility, the message, the truth, the virtue of the gospel and God's redemptive plan. This is the story of a human interaction with God, humanity's interaction with God, that carries this narrative. But even this, there are times where, as much as I think that there were challenges to our understanding of God in the New Testament and our expression of who God is, I think there are some in the Old Testament as well. Does that mean God didn't say this? No, not at all. I don't deny that at all. I think that this probably was what God said, and I think God inspired Ezekiel to record this stuff. But if we don't reconcile that there's paradox and confusion and contradiction in that, then we're not looking at the scriptures. So if you feel tension, you should. That's good. That means you're actually looking at scripture rather than just accepting it for what we've often been told. Don't question the scriptures. Don't question your authorities. Well, it doesn't mean that we had it perfect for 2,000 years. All right. So in 4, I skipped the best part. In 4 and 5, you get the stories of his antics that are just kind of funny. Some of them I mentioned to you. You can see in early 4 that catches my eye. Then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it, and you shall bear their punishment for the number of days that you lie there. So as long as you lied there, that's how many days they were going to be punished. And so there's, you got to imagine him lying on both sides of the street, building this little diorama. There's one about food, and he addressed some of the things that they were going to eat. Where's the other one that anyway, we'll look through 4 and 5 and you'll get some of those bits and pieces that sort of point to his theatrics. And that's kind of 1 through 11. And again, these are considered, this first part is in particular considered mostly what he has written. Chapters 12 through 24 really deal with more of an argument or a rationale for why Israel was being destroyed, and sort of preparation for what that's going to look like. He speaks in parables and analogies that he compares Israel, and I think it's worth just taking a quick peek at some of those. You can turn over to chapter 15, where he compares Israel to being the uselessness of a burnt stick, a useless vine. And in 16, he says God's a faithless bride, and talks about, I mean, really to some great extent, again, the theatrics come out. I put a bracelet on your arm, a chain on your neck, a ring on your nose, earrings on your ears, a beautiful crown upon your head. You were adorned with gold and silver. I trusted, and it goes on to paint this picture of this beautiful bride. But then the betrayal, and you move on to chapter or to verse 23. And after all your wickedness, you built yourself a platform. And it kind of just goes through this, accusing Israel of being like this unfaithful bride. And then you have in 15, you have a lion. And then in, I think my favorite, and I'm not going to read all of it, but it's a little racy, but it shows you just some of he talks about 2 sisters who were basically whores. And he doesn't spare. I mean, I'll just read you the first. I'll read you the first paragraph. And the word of the Lord came to me, mortals. There were 2 women, daughters of one mother, and they played the whore in Egypt. They played the whore in their youth. Their breasts were caressed there. Their virgin bosoms were fondled. Oholah was the name of the elder, and Oholibah is the name of her sister. And they became mine, and they bore sons and daughters for their names. And goes on and talks in somewhat explicit language that could make someone blush, but they're not talking about humans. They're saying Israel has been a whore to God, the faithful husband. But I mean, like, the language she uses is somewhat shocking. But again, we can't ignore it. This is part of the history of our faith. And so it's there, and it kind of portrays that. So he goes through that, and he kind of goes, and these are all the reasons why Israel will be destroyed. And then in 24, ending in that chapter in 24 verses 25 and 26, you have this sort of final proclamation of the imminent destruction of Israel. And you, mortal, on the day I take you from their stronghold, the joy and glory and delight in their eyes of their heart's affection, and also of their sons and daughters, on that day, the one who has escaped will come and report to you the news. On that day, your mouth should be open to the one who has escaped, and you shall speak and no longer be silent, and you shall be a sign to them, and they shall know that I am God. And this is God telling Ezekiel that the destruction is going to happen, and his job is just to proclaim it. And there are actually passages in this first 24 verse or chapters that sort of God says they're not going to listen to you. That was the worst part about being this prophet, is he went into it knowing failure was the result of what was going to happen, but he was called to be faithful in that regardless. 25 through 32 deals with the judge. It goes from judgment, and 12 through 24 is judgment on Israel, and then it goes 25 through 32, a sort of a judgment on all of the nations, and it lists the various nations. And then it talked, and in that it's called the oracles against the nation. And the interesting thing about that is that it names in particular Egypt and Tyre that God will judge, and those were major powerhouses at the time. And it basically is making the argument that not just Israel is going to be punished. Now, to the Jews, and historically, this was good news. There's kind of like some hope. This is like the turning point in the whole book. And then 33 is actually that hinge, but it's kind of like Israel's going to be punished, but not just Israel. Everyone else is going to get a good whooping too. And then it turns and it goes to, and what's interesting about that is you have this sort of proclamation against Israel that falls before that. And then you have this, and then the fall of Jerusalem and everything, and some promise of hope that happens after that. But in the middle of that, in the same way in the middle of Jeremiah, in the middle of Lamentations, you have this sign of hope. And we get that in chapter 33, where we see sort of a major shift or a hinge point in the book, where if you just turn to 33 there, 33:21, it says the fall of Jerusalem. There came to me a fifth day someone who had escaped from Jerusalem and came to me and said, the city has fallen. Now the hand of the Lord has been upon me in the evening, and the fugitive came. And so Jeremiah gets the message that Israel has fallen. That Israel, that his prophecy that Israel be just that Jerusalem will be destroyed has actually happened. And this is, and that harkens back to that 11, chapter 11, where it says Israel's idolatry would basically, bring about the destruction. And so it's the fulfillment of the prophecy to somewhat extent, and this messenger comes and gives him the news. And then you have a major turning point, and it goes from 34 to 37, and you see God's desires for Israel. There's a desire to remain connected to Israel and to not completely abandon. So the first part that says, where is God? Has God totally left us? In chapters 34, you see the promise of a new David, for a new Israel, a new king of sorts. And then in 36, you get the chapter that talks about God's transformation of Israel, and a renewal of their hardened hearts, and a renewal into a soft, moldable hearts. So there's this like promise of the hope of something else is going to happen. This is the passage where you get in 37, you get the valley of the dry bones. And if you turn to 37, you'll see, where is it? Valley of the dry bones, it says in the 37:5, thus says the Lord to God to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinew on you, and you'll cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So there's this sort of recasting of the creation account. This idea of dry bones, of ashes, of something that's lifeless, that Ezekiel's saying, no, that there's going to be a recreation. And there's going to be some sense of material, and you're going to get these bones and the sinews and the tendons, and you're going to be put into this place. And then there's and you have skin, and then I'm going to breathe life into you. The Spirit of God will be breathed into you the same way God breathed Spirit of life into Adam and in the creation account. And it ends with, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So that is a major part, and I'm sure you've heard the Valley of the Dry Bones. That's one of the visions. In 38, 39, you get an apocalyptic sort of scenario against all gods and all nations, or all nations who worship other gods and who oppose Yahweh. And there is this portrayal of this character, and you'll see it in 38, called the invasion of Gog. I wish Jim was still around, because I'd probably make a joke about his joke earlier. It would probably fit really well. But Gog is this character that is originally brought into, or this sort of personification of evil that we see in Genesis 10, and is brought back into. It's one of the few references that actually connects it. And the idea is that Gog is this sort of warrior, and he's a representation of all evil, and that he will be finally defeated. And it goes into a little bit more detail about that. But that's actually a chapter that's worth reading, and just sort of getting the portrayal and the judgment on God. And that is the kind of the New Testament notion of someday all evil will be destroyed, and we will be a world without evil. 40 to 48 is a vision of the new temple, and a new land and a new city, and sort of a utopian society that many scholars point out look a lot like that has a lot of resemblance to what the Garden of Eden would have been. So again, not only this passage saying, I'll breathe life into you, and I'll rebuild your bodies, and I'll give you this new sense of being, but there's going to be a new land and a new temple and a new city, and it's going to be this utopian society where everything is peachy keen. And in those final few verses, you get this sense of you get the vision of the chariot coming back, and that was that the vision. And I'm hopping around a little bit. One of the places in the middle of chapters is that you have this vision of the Babylonian captivity or conquering Jerusalem, and in this weird structure with these wings and multiple heads and thrones, leaves Jerusalem and goes towards exile. And so in some sense, the God is often called a God of exiled God. The God was exiled from his own holy city. And in this vision of what this new heaven and new earth, so to speak, or this new temple and this new holy city, the chariot structure comes back, meaning that God's presence is coming back. And there's also a sense in that there's an ally with other nations, and again, that's projecting that the salvation or redemption plan that God has extends beyond Israel. And then for some, and here's the one last important thing that I want to note, is it's not a new Jerusalem per se. It is a new city that is often referred to as the New Jerusalem, but it's not necessarily meant to be a reconstruction of the city itself, but something symbolically representative of the same thing that Jerusalem was represented as. Some people, again, I said that earlier, see this as a blueprint for what will be. Others see it more as symbolic imagery as what might be or what might characterize this new sort of thing, again, within the mindset of humanity and the way they imagine things. And that's it. I told you, these aren't my favorite books, so that's the best I can make sense of it for you in a short amount of time, without reading a book about it. But do you get the general sense of what's happening? I mean, they kind of overlap with a lot of these books. Yeah, Glenda.
How it's just hard when you read this, how literally to take what God is telling Ezekiel. Like when he tells him to lie on his one side for 390 something days. Is this just more like the Narnia Chronicles or some sort of I don't know parable?
Could be.
I just can't. You can't take. And some it's listed as visions, but some things when he tells them to, specific instructions of things he's supposed to do, does he actually lie on his side for 300?
I think so. I think those places are the literal places, the places where you get his vision or where it gets kind of trippy. And it's kind of like, I don't even understand, and maybe those are going to be reality. Maybe that's the exact representation of what it will be. I don't know. But, that's the part where when the book of Revelation, I'm just like, I don't even.
Yeah.
Well, and they did the bones. Didn't they make an army out of the bones? Is that what they fought the Grog with? They took all those bones and created an army?
I'm drawing a blank. What do you mean?
When the Valley of the Bones and they did the breath and all that, didn't they do that to create an army, and that army is the one that fought the Grog?
I didn't read that anywhere. Did you read that somewhere? Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Army.
What's that?
I'm trying to find it.
That may be the case. I mean, I think that again, this is all sort of futurist,
right?
So the Valley of the Dry Bones. Well, I mean, I think it actually was a valley, but the notion of what was happening, that the reconstruction none of it would have happened yet. But if you're saying there may be a reference that says those constructed from the Valley of Dry Bones would be the ones that helped defeat Grog, I don't know.
It's verse 10.
Verse 10 of where?
Of 37. It's where he says about a vast army.
Verse 10. I prophesied, I looked and upon them were sinews, flesh. I prophesied, he's commanded me, and the breath came on, they lived and stood on the feet of a vast multitude.
Oh, here it says army. Yeah.
Oh, I see. It says army, and that would definitely lead to a military. Mine says a vast multitude.
Right. multitude may make more sense.
Well, that, yeah, it wouldn't have such a militaristic sort of representation. Although an army doesn't necessarily mean military. You could have an army of something, just multiple meanings.
Do any of you remember that Negro spiritual about the bones? And then there's another one about the wheel.